I'm Austin Goen, the lead pastor of Bellevue Christian Church. We're a church where ordinary people are learning to live everyday life like Jesus, all because of what Jesus has done for us. And during this season in our church, we're just online, but hopefully over the coming weeks and months, we're going to be able to shift toward online and in person as well. If you haven't already, let us know that you're with us by saying hi in the chat, letting people know that you're here. If you're brand new this week, maybe you're joining us for the first time, maybe you stumbled across it by accident or a friend invited you, let us know because we'd love to get to know you a little bit better from a distance. And you can go to bellevuechristian.church/new to let us know that you joined us this morning. If at any point during the service or later this week you want somebody to pray with you, whether over the phone or just simply to be added to our prayer chain, you can go to bellevuechristian.church/prayer and there's a short form you can fill out. This morning we're going to start with worship. We're going to have our first sermon in a new series called Wisdom Over Information. And there's going to be an opportunity to take communion at home, so get that ready if you haven't already, and to give online, and some announcements at the end as well. So why don't you go ahead and join us for worship.
In Matthew's account of the Last Supper, it says that the disciples all sang a hymn together. And I often find myself wondering, what was that hymn? It'd be so cool to know what that hymn was. And in wondering about that, I think that maybe we're singing a similar hymn to what the disciples sang, because they're probably pulling things from the Psalms. They're probably praising God just for who he is. And we're still doing that today, 2,000 years later. And so we have a unique setup for BCC, a first time that I know of with all guys leading worship today. And so I like to think of us as a little bit of the disciples singing some praise to Jesus this morning. So please join us. And we're going to sing Raise a Hallelujah. So if you have hallelujahs to raise that are not written down on your screen, shout them out. Praise God this morning. I raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief.
worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever bring. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are, and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Jesus, Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder.
great the chasm that lay between us, how high the mountain I could not climb. In desperation, I turned to heaven and spoke your name into the night. Then through the darkness, your loving kindness tore through the shadows of my soul. The work is finished, the end is written. In Jesus Christ, my living hope. Who could imagine so great a mercy? What heart could fathom such boundless grace? The God of ages stepped down from glory to wear my sin and bear my shame. The cross has spoken, I am forgiven. The King of Kings calls me his own. Beautiful Savior, I'm yours forever. In Jesus Christ, my living hope. And hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe. Out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Let's sing that again. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe. Out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory.
At some point over the past few months, you've probably had at least one moment where you thought some version of this to yourself. I can't take it anymore. I don't want to know anything else about what's going on in the world. I don't want to read another article or watch another news broadcast or see one more Facebook update from my Uncle Jim. I don't have an Uncle Jim, so it's safe to say that. Or listen to another podcast episode or read another tweet from Taylor Swift or the President of the United States, or even hear any good news from John Krasinski or listen to another late night monologue. I don't care anymore. I don't want to know anything else, and you kind of shut it all down. Can you pinpoint the moment that you had that experience? Maybe you haven't had it yet. But my wife can pinpoint hers, and she's actually had this moment a few times, as have I. But the most recent one for her was this week when she was just scrolling through social media, specifically Facebook, and she was seeing pictures of babies from friends and stuff that people were sharing on the Buy Nothing group on Facebook. And suddenly, as she's scrolling through, she sees this headline. It says, Chinese authorities confirm case of bubonic plague in Inner Mongolia. You might be familiar with the bubonic plague from European history class in 11th grade. Shout out to Mr. Michelow at Northgate. The one that killed 50 million people in the 14th century, somewhere between 25% and 60% of the population, and known by its friendly name, Black Death. 1 second, though, Julie is looking at pictures of cute babies in cute headbands, and the next second, she's contemplating the possible resurgence of one of the most deadly pandemics in human history. And all the time, when we're on social media, we have experiences like that all the time. How does your brain process something like that? And when you actually read up on the bubonic plague, you find out that people actually get it every year, and it's extremely rare, and it's very treatable, and that the news is just sensationalizing the story because they know we're already hyper anxious about everything. But each of us has moments like this all the time, especially in a time of crisis where we're being bombarded with information from all over the world that may or may not have anything to do with our everyday lives. And it's interspersed with a question from our spouse about whether or not there's anything on the calendar tonight, and an email from Target telling you there's a deal on dehumidifiers. All of this information is coming our way at once. And if you felt like there's some information overload in your life recently, you're not alone. In 2014, Daniel Levitin, a neuroscientist and cognitive psychologist, wrote a book called The Organized Mind. And the subtitle is Thinking Straight in an Age of Information Overload. Now, it's about 400 pages long, which makes it feel a little bit like information overload, which is why I haven't actually read the book. I've just read the intro, which is usually where the best stuff in the book is anyways. And he argues, though, that we're being confronted with and creating more information than any society ever before in history. But most of us have not developed the tools to figure out how to navigate this sudden burst in information. Here's what he says about all the information. He says, but overall, we're just getting so much more information shot at us. The global economy means we are exposed to large amounts of information that our grandparents weren't. We hear about revolutions and economic problems in countries halfway around the world right as they're happening. We see images of places we've never visited and hear languages spoken we've never heard before. Our brains are hungrily soaking all this in because this is what they're designed to do. But at the same time, all this stuff is competing for our neuroattentional resources with the things we need to know to live our lives. That's what Julie was experiencing when she read about the possible resurgence of the bubonic plague, and what I experienced, about 2 months ago when I read about murder hornets for the first time. At one point, just to show about how much information is out there, Daniel Levitin says to imagine a 3x5 index card, something like this. And to imagine that all the information in the world was written on index cards like this. He doesn't tell you what font size or anything, so don't think too hard about this. But imagine all the information in the world is written down on 3x5 note cards. And then all of those note cards are divided up between everybody in the world, so 7 billion people. He says that you would personally have enough, and if the cards just you would personally have enough cards to cover every square inch of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. Those are small states, but still a lot of space. And again, I don't know the font size that he's talking about, but the point is, it's a lot of information that each of us are being bombarded with and have to learn how to navigate. Just to consider how much information we're encountering in a single day, let me do a quick information inventory of an average day of mine from the past week. First I read some of Hosea in the Bible in the morning, and there's some information. And then I read some of a book about the crucifixion, and then one about the Berenstain Bears, information. I checked Twitter, read dozens of tweets from people ranging from the President of the United States to my college roommate, more information. Checked a few news websites, mostly headlines, and then just skimmed the rest, information. Listened to something that Levi was trying to explain to me, information. Listened to a few stories on the Moth podcast while I was mowing, more information. Talked with Julie about her day, information. Read a dozen emails, information. Checked my mailbox at church, had an unmarked letter from somebody about why so-and-so is the Antichrist, information. Read a protest sign in somebody's yard, information. Read a counter-protest sign in somebody else's yard, information. Checked dozens of text messages, information. Caught a snippet of the 5 p.m. news briefing on NPR on the radio, information. Checked my home mailbox and it had an ad telling me why I shouldn't vote for Biden, information. Read the Wikipedia page on the bubonic plague, information. Talked with my neighbor about his thoughts on everything going on in the world, information. Watched Hamilton on Disney+, information. And the list goes on. Imagine now that you were doing your own information inventory. What kinds of things would be included simply over the course of a day? That's just the obvious stuff. That doesn't even include just most of the conversations I'm having or just the things that I'm observing in a given day. And so we're experiencing information overload. And the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to a world where we're being bombarded with so much information at once? And I've tried to simplify it down to 5 historical developments, which it's probably going to feel like more information overload, but 5 historical developments that kind of led to where we are over the course of the past couple of thousand years. Now, go back to 3500 BC, and writing was invented. Now, there's a history to how writing came about, but that's about when we pinpoint when writing became a thing. And so at some point between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, writing began to develop in the Mesopotamian world. So now instead of having to receive information directly through a conversation with somebody, you could now read something, if you were able to read, that somebody else had written down, even if you had never really met them. And writing continued to develop for the next couple of thousand years. Then in 1400 AD, so let's go ahead 5,000 years later, the printing press with something called movable type was made available, which eased the ability to produce copies of writings or copies of books. And this led to a wave of information that was suddenly available to more common people rather than just the rich. And it led to many of the reformations and revolutions that started to happen as people suddenly had access to information that only the elite had access to before. Now, before the printing press, the printing press was still acting as sort of a gatekeeper for what kind of information got out there. Let's skip ahead another 400 or so years, or 500 years or so, to the 1920s. You see the radio becoming popular, and then eventually phones, as well as phones and televisions eventually as well. And now you could get information from places that were geographically distant from you, instantaneously at the moment that it's being made available. Whether it's another episode of Little Orphan Annie, a reading of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, or a special broadcast about the invasion of Normandy. Then move ahead to the 1980s AD. You have the rise of the internet as the internet becomes commonplace. And this meant that anyone with an internet connection could get access to all kinds of information, and that anyone could publish information for anyone to access. It decentralized information. There weren't gatekeepers anymore in the same way. Anybody could create information, and anybody could access information. To prove my point about anybody creating information, in the late 90s, I think about 98 or 99, my dad helped me create my first website. This was before MySpace was popular or GeoCities, and he had his own website, and he created a hidden page on his website for me. And so what we did is we ripped a few Beanie Baby gifs from the TY website, we created a fun background, and we added information about me, which included my favorite movie at the time, which was called The Borrowers. It also included downloadable bylaws for my very own Beanie Baby Club, from which nobody could be excluded, which is a story for another day. And that was what the internet was enabling, 9-year-olds to create websites dedicated to Beanie Babies and The Borrowers. Information was decentralized, anybody could get it, and anybody could create it. And now skip ahead to 2007. You have the invention of the release of the iPhone. So I just actually watched the keynote speech that Steve Jobs gave introducing what was known as the iPhone. And suddenly, all of the information that's available on the internet was available in a device that fit in our pockets. Now, devices like this were available before the iPhone, but the iPhone changed the game, and we now live in a world where most people have a smartphone with access to the internet in our pockets. And we have access to more information in our pockets than Aristotle had in his lifetime. I think somebody said that somewhere. But all we do is we use our phones to find out what happened to the Olsen twins. And so we have all kinds of access to information. This is how we got to where we are. Some of those developments took place, back in 3500 BC, but many of those developments actually have taken place within our lifetimes or within the past 100 years. And those are huge shifts in the amount of information that we have to process in a given day, and it's making us tired and exhausted and fatigued. Here's again what Levitin writes. He says, our brains have the ability to process information we take in, but at a cost. We can have trouble separating the trivial from the important, and all this information and processing makes us tired. Neurons are living cells with a metabolism. They need oxygen and glucose in order to survive. And when they've been working hard, we experience fatigue. Every status update you read on Facebook, every tweet or text message you get from a friend is competing for resources in your brain with important things like whether to put your savings in stocks or bonds, where you left your passport, or how best to reconcile with a close friend you just had an argument with. We're being bombarded with information, and we're tired. And there's at least two ways that we're responding to this information overload. I want you to think about which one you gravitate toward. On the one end, there are those of us who binge as much info as possible, a word that was traditionally associated with freshmen at state universities. But it simply means a short period devoted to indulging in an activity to excess. The people who binge are the obsessors, or the people who cope with the overload by acquiring as much information as humanly possible on any given subject, only to find out that there's still more at the end of the day than when you started. Whenever I go to the Olive Garden, which is only when I have a gift card or Julie's parents are in town, I get the same thing. I get endless soup and salad. And I usually start with the chicken gnocchi, followed by the zuppa toscana, and then I come back to the gnocchi, or gnocchi. I never really know what to say. And as soon as I finish one bowl, there's another bowl on its way. And that's kind of what it feels like right now with information, that we're binging as much info as we can, only to find out that there's another bowl on its way. But eventually you just say, I can't eat anymore. I'm tired. I don't want any more bowls of food. I don't want any more information. Please take it away. I want to leave. And that leads to the next response. On the one end, again, there are those who binge, but on the other end, there are those of us who, when we're getting hit with all this information overload, we freeze. We see all the info that's out there, and we just simply give up. This is the ignorance is bliss strategy. This says, look, there's just too much information out there, so I'm better off not even getting started and just waiting for somebody to tell me what's going on in the world. It's coping with the overload by covering your ears and singing loudly. And this is the moment that I talked about earlier, that moment where we just have seen too much information and we just shut down. Our family computer is a Mac, and up until a few months ago, when we cleared some space on it, but it was very crowded before that, it would get what we would lovingly call the rainbow pinwheel of death, which is the equivalent of the hourglass on Microsoft. And when we opened too many things at once, that pinwheel of death would pop up and sometimes never go away. The reality is there was simply too much information being stored on our computer, and it couldn't handle what we were trying to do with it at that point. And so it responded by freezing and sometimes shutting down. And that's what it feels like for those of us whose default response now is to freeze when we see more information coming our way. But the problem is that we actually still need information in order to live well. And so there are those of us who are binging, there are those of us who are freezing, there are those of us who are going, sitting somewhere in between both of those things, or are oscillating between them. Over the past few months, I found myself in both spots. With the rise of COVID-19, and again with the response to the death of George Floyd, I was binging as much information as possible, reading articles from all over the internet, living on social media. But after a few days, everything I had just read felt irrelevant, and I found myself going back to another zuppa toscana of information, trying to catch up. And then I found myself freezing because of how overwhelmed I was by all the information, avoiding anything that smelled like information, avoiding the news, logging off social media, not even wanting to read books anymore. There's just too much out there. And so there's more information in the world than ever. And some of us are responding by binging as much as possible, and others of us are freezing up, and many of us have been through both phases. But the question I want us to consider is, what if there's a third way to navigate the information overload? What if there's a third way to navigate the information overload? It's an ancient Hebrew word that shows up 148 times in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's the word chokmah. You got to really go after that guttural at the beginning. It's a common word that's most often translated simply as wisdom. In addition to lots of appearances in the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, which are 2 out of the 3 books that are considered Jewish wisdom literature, it shows up most often, 46 times, in the 3rd book of wisdom literature, which is known simply as Proverbs. It's a 31-chapter book, mostly composed of sayings from King Solomon, but also a man named Agur. And I think that it's this word, wisdom, or chokmah, that will help us navigate this world of info overload. So let's talk a little bit about wisdom, and then we'll bring it back to how that relates to information. Now, a little bit of background on King Solomon. King Solomon is the son of King David, which makes him the 3rd king or monarch of Israel. He reigned for about 40 years, from 970 to 931 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. He was known primarily for his wisdom all over the world at the time, his building of the temple in Israel, and for the fact that he entered into hundreds of marriages, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes purely because of lust. It's a detail that the Bible doesn't hide, because if you might remember from the book of Esther, the Bible does not hide the dark sides of its characters, but it reveals them, because ultimately that points us to Jesus in the end. So it doesn't hide that fact about him. And there's a famous story in 1 Kings, which is the historical record of the kings of Israel and Judah, that explains the origin of his wisdom. In 1 Kings 3, which you can read on your own time, God appears to him in a dream and invites him to ask him for anything he wants. But instead of asking for wealth or fame, as you might expect, Solomon asked for a discerning heart, or wisdom, to govern and lead well. And that's in 1 Kings chapter 3. Then in 1 Kings chapter 4, you get a description of the kind of wisdom that he had. Here's what it says in 1 Kings chapter 4. It says, God gave Solomon a very wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. It's very specific. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. He's what you could call a philosopher king. He's not just somebody who knew politics, he's somebody who knew science, he's somebody who understood reality. He had wisdom about how the world works. And that brings us back to the book of Proverbs, which is a book that's mostly a collection of wise sayings from Solomon that are meant to encourage people to pursue wisdom. It was specifically written for his children and the youth who are stepping into leadership in the empire, but it applies to all of us. Chapters 1 through 9 of the book are mostly an intro to wisdom before you really get into the heart of the sayings. But it's kind of framing a philosophy of wisdom. And at the heart of that, there's a section in Proverbs chapter 8 that helps us get a sense of what wisdom is all about. And I want us to take a look at 3 quick things that we learn about wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, 1 through 21. So if you have your Bibles this morning, open up to Proverbs chapter 8, 1 through 21. We're not going to read that whole section, but I just want to look at 3 different things we learn about wisdom in this section. The first thing is this, is that wisdom is one road among many. Wisdom is one road among many. You might say many wrong roads. The section opens with wisdom being personified, which is just a literary term for acting like a person. It's not just abstract. And that wisdom is calling out at an intersection, at a high point, at a very busy intersection in the empire. And here's what it says. It says, at the highest point along the way, where the paths meet, so basically an intersection, she takes her stand. Beside the gate leading into the city, at the entrance, she cries aloud, to you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind. You who are simple gain prudence. You who are foolish set your hearts on it. Listen, for I have trustworthy things to say. I open my lips to speak what is right. And she goes on to talk a little bit more about wisdom. But wisdom is essentially telling you which course to take among many options. Wisdom is standing at an intersection, telling you which course to take. Now, if you've lived in Pittsburgh for a while, one of the things you know is that we have some insane intersections in our city. I've always heard that Pittsburgh roads feel like somebody just dropped spaghetti on a map and just decided to create intersections all over the place in weird places. And there's one in Brighton Heights that I think is one of the worst intersections. It's a 5-way intersection where I always feel like I'm going to die. And you can imagine wisdom is standing in the middle of that road, trying to point you toward the street that you should go down among many possible options that will take you to the destination, which is the good life, according to Proverbs, that will take you to the destination you want to go. Except in this case, there's one road that leads to flourishing, and the other 4 roads lead to sudden death. And to make it more complicated, as the next chapter of Proverbs says, folly, which is the opposite of wisdom, is yelling equally as loud, trying to tell you to take other roads. And so wisdom is trying to tell you to take one road among many options. So wisdom is one road among many, standing at the different intersections of our life, the different decision-making points of our life, trying to tell us which way to go. The second thing about wisdom is this, is that wisdom is worth more than anything else. Wisdom is worth more than anything else. Listen to what wisdom says. It's a common theme you're going to see in Proverbs. She says, choose my instruction instead of silver, knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Proverbs 8:10-11. You see the same theme all throughout the book. This theme of wisdom being more valuable than riches. And the reason it's worth more than anything else is because if you don't have wisdom, you risk losing anything else that you gain. That if you have everything but wisdom, you ultimately risk losing everything in the end. One story that always comes to mind when I think about this is you might remember in 2014, if you're somebody who follows sports, when Johnny Manziel was drafted as the new quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. He was the first college freshman to win the Heisman, and he was a 22nd overall draft pick in the 2014 draft. And it launched him into sudden fame and wealth. But if you follow the rest of his story, you know that he ended up throwing it all away, along with the Browns' chances of a winning season because of his unwise behavior on and off the field that at one point involved a Planet Hollywood in Las Vegas. And that kind of blew the next season for the Browns and the following seasons after that. Sorry, Mom. But that's why wisdom is worth more than anything else, because without it, you risk losing anything else that you gain. So that's why it's the primary thing worth more than anything else. And that brings us to the third thing about wisdom. So wisdom is one road among many. Wisdom is worth more than anything else. And wisdom is to be pursued rather than waited for. No one happens upon wisdom accidentally. You might find some wisdom accidentally, but you don't become a wise person accidentally. You have to go after it. Wisdom says this, I love those who love me, and those who seek me find me. Proverbs 8, verse 17. And in Proverbs 4:7, it says this, the beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Go after it, chase it, pursue it. There's an intentionality to becoming a person of wisdom. You might have heard of something called the Fenn treasure. 10 years ago, there was a millionaire art dealer named Forrest Fenn who hid a treasure chest with gold nuggets that was worth about $2 million somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. He's actually still alive today. He hid it when he was 80 years old. And he left nothing but a cryptic poem and a map as clues to where to find it. And he said that he didn't hide it in a mine or didn't hide it next to a structure or anywhere dangerous because, again, he was 80 years old when he hid it. And about 250,000 people went searching and have searched for this treasure over the past decade. In fact, 4 people died while looking for this treasure. But someone, about a month ago, actually found it. It's apparently that it just took till quarantine and a worldwide pandemic for somebody to actually go find it. And it was sitting right where Forrest Fenn left it. We don't know anything about the person who found it. They're not revealing their name. But we know that they didn't find it by waiting around for the treasure to come to them. They went and pursued it. They put all of their energy toward finding that treasure. Why? Because they knew it was worth more than anything else. It was worth more than anything else. So that brings us to this question, what exactly is wisdom? What exactly is wisdom? Whenever I define wisdom, I always go back to a definition from Eugene Peterson that appears in the intro to Proverbs in his paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. And here's what he says. He says, wisdom is the art of living skillfully in whatever actual conditions we find ourselves. He says it has virtually nothing to do with information as such, with knowledge as such. A college degree is no certification of wisdom. Again, wisdom is the art of living skillfully in whatever actual conditions we find ourselves. It's essentially about living well in everyday life amidst the variety of choices that lie before us. Notice again, this is kind of starting to bring it back to information, how wisdom and information relate. He says it's more than information or knowledge, which is why we can have access to more information than any society in history, but not be any wiser. Now, here's how Andy Crouch, another writer who I like, talks about wisdom and the relationship between wisdom and information. He says, our knowledge. He says, knowledge these days is very easy to come by, almost too easy, given the flood of search results for almost any word or phrase you can imagine. But you can't search for wisdom, at least not online. And it's as rare and as precious as ever. Maybe, given how complex our lives have become, rarer and more precious than before. And that brings together some of these ideas we've talked about wisdom being worth more than anything else, wisdom helping us navigate a complex intersection, wisdom being pursued rather than waited for. But all of this really brings us back now to the relationship between wisdom and information, and how wisdom provides us with a third option for navigating the age of information overload. If wisdom is the art of living skillfully, in whatever conditions we find ourselves, that means that we can't live well without accurate information or knowledge about what those actual conditions are in which we find ourselves. In other words, you could say it this way: you can't be wise without information or knowledge. We need solid and true information about how the world works in order to live skillfully. But just as you can't be wise without information, information alone doesn't make you wise. So we can't be wise without information, but information alone doesn't make you wise, as Andy Crouch just hinted at, especially if that information is wrong or incomplete or inconclusive or biased or leading you in a weird direction. So that's why the first discipline or skill of wisdom actually has to do with how we navigate an increasingly complex world of information. You could think of the first skill of a wise person as your capacity to do what we might call information triage. Information triage. Maybe you don't know what that word triage means. I didn't know what the word triage meant until 2017, specifically October 2017, when Julie and I went to McGee Women's Hospital to give birth to Levi. She was overdue, and we had an appointment at a nearby office, and they sent us to McGee in order to determine whether or not we should induce labor. And we went into the first area we went into was called triage, where we met some nurses and some other people who helped us determine the urgency of our situation and decide what we should do next. Now, in the next couple of hours, we found ourselves being asked lots of different questions and going through some tests. But the next thing we knew is that we were sitting in a hospital room watching Harry Potter Part 2 of Part 7 in a hospital bed. And about 24 hours later, Levi was born. But the first thing we did when we went into that hospital was triage so that they could decide what to do with us and where we should go next. Triage is the process of determining the most important people or things amongst a large number of things that require attention. It comes from the French word for sort or sift or classify. And Daniel Levitin, in his book, The Organized Mind, says that that's what we have to do with all the info that comes our way that's out there. In other words, like triage nurses, we have to constantly make decisions about what info is most important and most urgent and most helpful and on which we're going to build our lives. So that brings us to how these things relate. In a world of information overload, the first skill of a wise person is information triage. In a world of information overload, the first skill of a wise person is information triage, of being able to discern which information to build your life on. It's the capacity to transform information into wisdom. In a world of information overload, the first skill of a wise person is information triage. Triage, the capacity to turn information into wisdom. That's what this next series is all about. It's about wisdom. It's called Wisdom Over Information. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at 4 different sayings from the book of Proverbs that can actually help us develop this skill. I thought about just doing a bunch of Proverbs that I like, but I want to focus specifically on Proverbs that help us navigate information. 4 tools that will help us to do effective information triage for transforming information into wisdom. We're going to talk about forming an initial posture Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." And our approach to information starts with a posture of worship, a God-word posture. In a world where God is often left out of the equation, we want to ask, how can we be a church where we turn to God and his word before we ask Google? Another thing that we're going to talk about is intellectual humility. Proverbs 18, verse 2 says, "Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." That sounds like the definition of social media. In a world where it's easy to spout opinions loudly and create straw men out of the opinions of others, Isaac Ames is going to help us imagine what it could be like to be people who seek to understand before we're understood. And then we're going to talk about intentional range or diversity. Proverbs 11:14 says this, "For lack of guidance, a nation," but you could also say a person, "a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisors." What's true of a nation is also true of individuals. In a world where we tend to only listen to people who agree with us and affirm our opinions, my friend Josh Pay is going to help us imagine what it could look like to be a church that escapes our feedback loops and seeks a wide range or a diversity of inputs. And then we're going to end by talking about the tool of informed urgency. Proverbs 19:2 says, "Desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way?" We're also going to flip that proverb on its head and consider, what about knowledge without desire or zeal? In a world where we're pressured to act quickly on the first information that we hear, or not to act at all because we don't know all the facts, Josh Hoy is going to help us imagine what it could be like to be a church that practices informed urgency. And so we're going to talk about in this series, Wisdom Over Information, we're going to give you 4 tools for navigating information overload, talking about initial posture, intellectual humility, intentional range, and informed urgency. And to help you make the most of this series, I want to suggest 3 practices to do over the next month. The first is this, is every day, ask God for wisdom. Make this a part of your prayer life where you're asking God for wisdom. Start by a habit of asking God for wisdom before you're working on a paper for school or before you're making a big decision. But James 1:5 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Every day, start a habit of asking God for wisdom. Now a habit for every week. Every week, turn off social media and the news for a day. We have to turn off our inputs every once in a while in order to process what we're learning. This is something I've done well during certain seasons of my life. It's something I've struggled with a little bit lately. And I encourage you to try this with me. Every week, just take one day where we turn off social media. You can put up a post about it if you want, maybe from this series. Or don't look at news for a day and just process what it is that you've already learned. And then finally, so every day, ask God for wisdom. Every week, turn off social media and news for a day. And then every month, read the whole book of Proverbs. And so over the course of the next month, I encourage you to actually read through the whole book of Proverbs. When I was first starting to read the Bible regularly, this practice was suggested to me in order to help me build a habit of reading the Bible. There's 31 chapters in Proverbs. There's about 31 days in most months. And so you can read through the book of Proverbs every month. And just if you miss a day, just skip to the next day. Don't worry about it. Just start with whatever day it is. Today is the 12th. Just start with the 12th chapter of Proverbs. And so I've been through that book many times now over the course of my life, and it's worked its way into my bones. But this series is about a month long, and I encourage you to take this month to actually read through the book of Proverbs. And so wisdom is the art of living skillfully in whatever actual conditions we find ourselves. And the secret to navigating information overload is not freezing or binging, but wisdom. It's learning how to do information triage so that we can separate the good from the bad, the important from the unimportant, and transform information into wisdom. I want this so bad for our church right now. I've been praying this over our church right now, that we learn the art of living skillfully in whatever conditions we find ourselves. We are all right now, individually and collectively, navigating a variety of societal crises, the kind of stuff that you read about in history books, pandemics, economic recessions, racial injustices, and all in a year of a presidential election. And in addition to those, we're also all going through our own personal crises as we're having questions about parenting toddlers and teenagers, struggling through the difficulties of singleness or marriage, conflicts at work, or just even a lack of work right now, and all kinds of other stuff. And it can be tempting to think that the way through a crisis is to binge information or to avoid it completely. But I believe that the only way through crisis is the path of wisdom. It's wisdom that's going to lead to life and health in our church. And I believe that churches like ours can show the world around us what it looks like to walk in the way of wisdom in a world of information. I believe this is a great time to be the church, and that one of the ways that we can be a witness right now is by being a church that learns how to walk the path of wisdom. As we close, though, I want us to remember something that's probably the most significant thing that we could say today. And it's this, is that the wisdom of Solomon doesn't save us. Jesus does. The wisdom of Solomon doesn't save us. Jesus does. For all of our attempts to be wise, we're going to have moments in our lives and entire seasons where we listen to the way of foolishness instead of the way of wisdom, the path that leads to death rather than life. But when Jesus came, he said this. He said that one greater than Solomon is here. One who doesn't just tell us how to live, although he told us plenty of that, but rather one who lived the wisest life in our place and died the fool's death that only we deserve in our place. And then he says, for those of us who trust in him, the scriptures say that Jesus dwells within us. The one in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge makes his home within us. He doesn't just tell you how to be wise and hope you can figure it out. He actually puts himself inside of us and gives us the power to become people who can walk on the way of wisdom. And he takes care of our past mistakes. He takes care of the death we deserve for walking in the way of folly. And some of you are thinking, that's been my life. I've been walking in the way of folly. You know that you've lived the unwise life. You know that you're trying to be wiser, but you know that that's not enough to make up for the past. I want to give you a chance this morning to put your trust in Jesus, the one who is wise in our place and took the death that we deserved. If that's you, I just want you to repeat this short prayer after me as a way of deciding that you're going to follow Jesus and give your life to him and trust him. Repeat this short prayer after me. God, I'm not wise. I've ignored wisdom and walked the road that leads to death. But I know you took that death in my place. It's your wisdom, not my own, that saved me. And now I ask you to dwell in me, that I might live wisely, not by my own wisdom, but by your wisdom within me. Amen. Now we come to this table where we break bread and we drink juice, which represents Christ's body broken for us and his blood poured out for us. It's here that we remember that Jesus, the true wisdom of God, died the fool's death so that we might become wise. It's here as we come to this table that we remember that in him are found all the riches of wisdom and knowledge. And I encourage you to take a few minutes to take communion at home and to give online and then to stay with us for announcements. Thanks for joining us at Bellevue Christian Church Online, a church where ordinary people are learning to live everyday life like Jesus, all because of what Jesus has done for us. If you haven't already, subscribe to our weekly email by going to the front page of our website at bellevuechristian.church. That is the best way to stay up to date with everything that's going to be happening and all the changes we'll be experiencing in the coming weeks and months. If you need prayer, go to bellevuechristian.church/prayer. You can fill that out at the form there anytime this week. If you need care right now, financially, spiritually, or otherwise, let us know by reaching out to our care team with an email at care@bellevuechristian.church, and someone will follow up with you. We don't have an update yet on when we're going to be reopening. As we mentioned last week, we have delayed our reopening given the spike in cases, but we do hope to discern God's will for our church in the next few weeks as our council meets together again soon, and will allow us to then begin to set a new target date for reopening. In the meantime, though, you can find our most recent updates at bellevuechristian.church/coronavirus. Another thing I want to mention is that in the coming weeks, you're going to notice a few changes to our video and the way we do our services. We're going to begin recording with some new cameras. You might be able to see them behind me, maybe not. There's 2 new cameras that we have that are going to provide a way for us to actually film our service in the sanctuary that will eventually allow us to live stream that service as well. And so we're going to start by trying to record the whole sermon and then maybe even a whole service in the next few weeks. So be watching out for that. Our team keeps describing it as building an airplane mid-flight, which means we're already in the air, we're already moving, we don't have a ton of time to think about how we want to do things, and we're working it out as we go, as we're experimenting and testing and trying all kinds of new things. A lot of churches, when they introduce something like this, have months to prepare where they aren't worried about anything else. They're just really focused on this. We're doing it in a matter of months, but in the midst of a crisis, and we're trying to figure it out on a much shorter timeline. So be patient with us as we're solving really complex problems every week. We have some people who are working really hard behind the scenes so that we can have a great experience for you at home. And as you see some of these changes, let us know what you like and what you don't like and what we could do better. That will help us create the best experience possible for you. And now I want to share a quick update from me and my family, a little video that we made. Hello from the Going Home. As many of you know, we are expecting a baby girl at the end of July, and we wanted to provide you guys with a little bit of an update about that.
Yeah, so some of you maybe didn't know that we were expecting, but July 31st is our due date for our baby girl. Levi is very excited to be a big brother. We're really looking forward to introducing her to you all one day. It's been weird to not see you all during this quarantine, and again, if you didn't know I was expecting, now you do. But we're looking forward to the day when we can all gather again. You might not see Levi and I for a little bit as we kind of adjust once the baby comes, but we can't wait to share the news with you of her birth whenever that happens.
Levi, who are you holding? Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones made an appearance.
He wants to be part of the video. It's my action figure from high school, not younger, surprisingly.
Yeah, can you say hi, church family?
Hi, church family.
Hey Levi, we've been learning the Lord's Prayer at home. Do you think you can say the Lord's Prayer for everybody? Why don't you try?
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy kingdom come, your will be done, your wrath heaven. If there are daily bread, give us, and say we forgive to sins us, we bear brother from evil. Amen.
Amen. It gets a little bit slurred together at the end, but
we might have to give you captions for that.
That's our quarantine accomplishment. Anyways, looking forward to seeing you guys all again, and looking forward to letting you guys meet us as a family of 4. See you guys later.
Bye.
Say bye.
Bye.
So as we mentioned in the video, as we move to the end of July, we're going to be preparing for our baby in the Goen household, and you'll get to hear from some guest speakers as we move toward the end of this month and throughout the rest of this series as Julie and I take some time off to get to know our new baby girl. Let me close now with the Great Commission. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And I'll be with you always, even to the very end of the age."